Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ash here coming at you today in Clash Royale. First off, I wanted to thank you all for the ton of positive feedback that I received on yesterday's video with Marcelp. It was definitely one of my favorite to make, and there'll be more just like it coming really soon. So for today's video, it's going to be another pro tips, but this time you're stuck with just me. No pro actually on the audio, but I did get a full deck write-up on this awesome, really very effective Xbow deck shared by SaintBelikin. Now, SaintBelikin was able to finish top 10 last season with his sponsored account, and he's sharing this deck with me today and you guys, and hopefully in today's video, you're going to walk away with a better understanding of how to play the deck and have success with it. So let's get to SaintBelikin's tips. So the overall deck philosophy, what you're trying to do with this deck. So this deck is all about taking advantage of your opponent when they're low on elixir. Pretty simple, right? I mean, you can make elixir deficits in many different ways for your opponent. You can wait till they drop a heavy unit, such as an elixir pump, a P.E.K.K.A, a Hound, or a Golem, or you can just make good positive elixir trades or counter pushes to give you that advantage. And once you have it, you can take down the tower, you can punish them with big pushes, and then as soon as that tower is in range to die via the rocket, you can rocket down the last few HP if necessary. So when using the Xbow in this deck, you need to make sure you place the Xbow in the position that we show in the video. SaintBelikin says this is super important here. The position allows for the Inferno Tower to be placed next to the Xbow, and Giants will attack the Inferno Tower instead of the Xbow. However, be careful because sometimes you may deploy the Xbow one tile too far away from the tower. And if you're like me and you're not an usual Xbow user, I'm not much of a siege player in general. I rarely use Royal Giant or Xbow or Mortar. I do have great admiration for people who can use them with a lot of success. So a little cheat for you guys, and it's very easy obviously, and it's a little obvious too, but you want to make sure you drag the Xbow and don't place it right away until you see that tower kind of glow with that white glow. Make sure you have it locked on in range. So now sticking with the offense on this deck, let's talk about the cards that are going to support your Xbow. So the Ice Golem, according to SaintBelikin, is the #1 support card for the Xbow. And there's two ways to combo the Ice Golem with your Xbow. And a lot of it really depends on the rotation of your deck. So whatever card comes first is generally going to dictate the way that you play the Ice Golem in support of the Xbow. And man, I am saying Xbow a ton. Sorry guys, I guess this is an Xbow deck. But if this was a drinking game or a Kool-Aid drinking game for those of you who are underage, I think you'd all be either drunk or on a sugar high every time I say Xbow, Xbow, Xbow. So the two ways to play the Ice Golem. It depends on if the Ice Golem is in your hand first or the Xbow is in your hand first. But ideally, you're going to go ahead and play the Ice Golem behind your King Tower, assuming that you want to use an Xbow push. And then what you want to do is wait for the Ice Golem to catch up to the area that you would be deploying the Xbow. Make sure the Ice Golem always goes in front of the Xbow, such as Belikin just did on the replay right there. He's supporting the Xbow right now, so the goal here is, you know, when you drop the Xbow, your opponent is going to try to counter it, right? And eventually, you're going to be able to stop that counter, hopefully, and let that Xbow connect with the tower. Once you get the connection, you're going to easily chip away hundreds of HP off that tower. So once you get a read on what your opponent's going to counter your win condition with, make sure you go ahead and try to predict. A lot of the Xbow Siege gameplay is all about prediction. But digressing back a little bit to the use of the Ice Golem, #1 is playing him behind the King Tower and then waiting, saving up more elixir, then dropping the Xbow as the Ice Golem passes that spot. And the other way is playing the Ice Golem in front of the Xbow after it's deployed. So the reason, again, really depends on your own cycle. So what about the Inferno Towers? Well, the Inferno Tower offers great defense against tanks, as well as being a brick wall for Hog Rider and a buffer for elite Barbarians. This is the core of your defense against big pushes. But beware, most decks that use big pushes usually have a tombstone as well, or minions, and the minions and the skeletons spawned by the tombstone can distract your Inferno Tower, so just be on the lookout for that. And to combat it, you can use your Ice Golem up front. This will prevent those units, those skeletons or those minions from tanking essentially for their main tank, and it stalls them from dealing damage to your towers or your Inferno Tower. If you don't have the Ice Golem, excuse me, up in rotation, you can try using the Ice Spirit, and if you have enough elixir, archers paired with an Ice Spirit, try to spread the archers away from your towers and away from your Inferno Tower so your opponent can't get that value fireball. But the archers and Ice Spirit can be a lethal defensive weapon, especially against a really big tank push, and that really applies to any deck. So use Inferno Tower, archers, Ice Spirit, and use Ice Golem if you have it in rotation. I truly do think, and I think Belekin would agree with me, that Ice Golem is definitely the most useful card in the game. I think it is, according to Woody's last popularity snapshot, I'm pretty certain it's the second most popular card in the game behind the Zap card. I think Zap is in over 80% of decks at the top of ladder. That's insane. I think the Ice Golem was right behind it in the 70 percentile. So certainly if you're not using Ice Golem, maybe you should give him a try. Alright guys, so now we've talked about the win condition, how to use your Xbow, how to protect your Xbow with the Ice Golem, what you want to do with the Xbow. You want to get a tower, you want to get it locked onto a tower, and then you want to use your rocket to finish it off there so you can switch lanes and concentrate on the other tower once you get it within rocket range. We've talked about defense in terms of how to stop a big push. Now let's talk about how to combat against difficult cards against siege decks in the meta. Specifically, let's talk about Balloon, and then let's talk about how to deal with a Zap bait deck, because we're starting to see a lot more of those, and this deck is missing the Zap spell. It has no fireball. We have to talk a little bit about how to deal with those Zap bait decks. You really only have the log. So let's talk about the Balloon first. So if your opponent has a Balloon, it can be a lethal way to stop an Xbow. It's fast moving in terms of its damage, because as soon as it gets near that Xbow, boom, the Xbow is going to be down. The Balloon does the most damage in the entire game per hit. So how do you deal with a balloon? Well, Belekin's best advice for balloons is, once you know they're using the balloon, you want to save your Ice Spirit and your Mega Minion for when you use your Xbow, because the Ice Spirit and the Mega Minion is going to buy you plenty of time, and that's going to be able to stop that balloon from absolutely destroying your Xbow. So make sure you save those counters. Don't use them frivolously once you know they're playing the balloon. Against Zap Bait, he uses the Ice Golem and archers, or both, to deal with the Skarmy, so we can save the log to deal with either the mirrored Skarmy or the Goblin Barrel. Remember, with the mirrored variation of the bait deck going around, it can be very tricky. You have to save the log for the second wave. For the first wave, go ahead and just use your archers or the Ice Golem to distract one of the goblins. You have to make sure you play smart here, because you know that second wave of Goblin Barrel is going to be coming, and that's when you're going to want to save your log. So just make sure you identify the opponent's win condition, and then you'll have a much easier time countering it using the cards that you do have in your defensive arsenal. So I do think it's important to talk about how Belekin recommends defending against graveyard pushes or graveyard decks and against elite barbarians, because they're everywhere. But before we do that, I thought it was important to mention, I asked Belekin, is there any situation in where you'd play your Xbow defensively? And he said absolutely there is. And it's if he's at an elixir disadvantage and his opponent's win condition is a defensive structure targeting troops such as a Hog Rider, a Giant, a Golem, a Balloon, etc., he'll play the defensive Xbow with a 4-3 plant, so it can pull all ground defensive targeting units, and the defensive Xbow means they have to attack you, allowing you to set up a counter attack and recoup some of your elixir. So that would be the circumstance that he recommends using the defensive Xbow. If you know you're at a sizable elixir disadvantage, you have a lot of other options in the deck, a lot of cheap options to support that defensive Xbow in the log, in the Ice Spirit, in the Ice Golem. So go ahead and defend, let them come to you. An Xbow is very difficult to go in against, and then you can go ahead again, like I said, and recoup your elixir. So what about elite barbarians? How do you deal with them? Well, within an offensive Xbow, he tries to use the Ice Golem Golem right away in front of the Xbow as soon as he places the Xbow, and then after that he'll play the Mega Minion and the Ice Spirit or the Log depending on what he has in his rotation. Now how about LavaLoon? I asked him how he deals with LavaLoon, and he said he had a very specific strategy, so listen up. Here it is. Against LavaLoon players, or even against any Lava Hound player, as soon as they drop the Lava Hound, he'll immediately, if he has it, and he'll try to make sure he does have it as soon as he identifies what deck they're playing, he'll immediately drop his Xbow. And what he does is he does not defend the Xbow, so he's not dropping that Ice Golem immediately afterwards unless they commit to attacking his Xbow. So what he wants to do is let them make the next move. So they drop Lava Hound, you drop Xbow. It's like a chess match. And then if they try to attack your Xbow, if they're going to use the Skarmy, the Mega Minion, or Minions, which are the common cards in a LavaLoon deck, he'll use just his Ice Golem and Archers. If they rush the other lane, he'll do a 4-2 Inferno Plant and try to assassinate the balloon with the Mega Minion and Ice Spirit. So let me repeat that. If they try to rush the other lane after he drops the Xbow, he'll do a 4-2 Inferno Plant, and then he tries to essentially assassinate the balloon with the Mega Minion and Ice Spirit. Assassinate was the word he used. So aggressive. I love it. So against a graveyard deck, and by the way, guys, I should mention, if you're unfamiliar with the planting locations, I mentioned 4-2 and 4-3 with the Xbow, 4-2 with the Inferno Tower. I'll go ahead and link a video by OJ that explains all the defensive placements. I think it's a really knowledgeable and useful video, pretty much like all of his videos, so be sure to check that out if you're unsure on the proper placement. Also, I'm sure you can watch some of the examples that I've shown so far on the video today. So what about graveyard? Let me put on one final replay here. This should be about it. And the first one here, yes, this is a good replay. So he's going against a Golem Elite Barbarian deck in this fourth replay here, and this deck is a pain in the neck, guys. I mean, this deck is like my least favorite to go against because you always do pretty well against it, at least I do, in the first 2 minutes, but this deck in overtime is absolutely brutal. You always have to be aware of the big Golem push, and you know, sometimes, unfortunately, it results in a 3 crown against you, against the good guys. So anyway, back to the graveyard though. How do you deal with a graveyard deck with this deck? Alright, so graveyard is definitely one of the worst matchups for this deck. So be aware that graveyard is very difficult. That is your most difficult deck that you'll be going against in terms of overall deck archetype and the most difficult win condition to defend against with this deck. However, you can win. You need to save the archers for when they use graveyard. That's an obvious. You also need to try to save the Ice Golem for when they use graveyard, and that's a little bit more difficult because your Ice Golem is going to double as your most effective distraction against Elite Barbarians. It's going to be your most important protection card for the Xbow. As we already mentioned, Ice Golem is so important and it's such a versatile card that you're going to have to try to save it, especially if they're playing freeze and graveyard. You're going to need both the archers and the Ice Golem. Now, what about the bowler graveyard deck? That can be really difficult with this deck. So Belekin says that a really smart player might want to just go for the tie, and with an Xbow deck, you actually have the luxury of being able to play for a tie fairly easily. You can use the defensive Xbow only throughout the entire match, and that's going to be a great defense not only against the bowler, but also against the graveyard. You're still going to have to rely on the Ice Golem and the archers to defend against the skeletons themselves, but the Xbow, after it finishes off whatever's coming at you in that lane, it's going to switch to the skeletons and help out there, and oftentimes you'll just end up in a draw, so that would be the safe way out against that deck. So guys, I can't let you go without giving you the top 3 mistakes that Belekin says people make, especially when they're just starting out with an Xbow deck. So mistake number 1 we already talked about. It's placing the Xbow too far back. That's an obvious mistake. You want to make sure you don't make it. A mistake number 2 is dropping the Xbow when you're at 6 elixir. Now this might be a little bit of a polarizing topic among Siege players. I know some people don't mind doing it if they know or they think they have their opponent in a weak spot, but Belekin says never never do it. The Xbow needs to be supported, says Belekin. They cannot compete well all by themselves. Belekin says the magic number is 9. 9 elixir is when you want to be dropping your Xbow. Remember, it has a full 1 second deploy delay that will give you a little bit extra time to recoup and help defend your Xbow. So make sure you defend it and drop it at 9. And the last mistake is if you know your opponent plays Rocket like you do, Rocket can be a super hard counter. You can use Rocket defensively, but you don't want people to use it defensively against you and totally kill not only your Xbow, but also your Xbow supporting units. So make sure if you know your opponent has Rocket, you play the Xbow all by itself and then catch them next time with a Rocket out of rotation. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on how to play and have success with the Xbow deck. I hope you walked away from this video with a better understanding and knowledge of the deck and how it works. Wishing you the best of luck. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks so much to SaintBelikin for sharing his replays and his strategy advice. Guys, thanks so much for watching, and as always, take care, guys.